TOJ Talks Badlands, presented by Badlands episode. Last week we had Mike Giardi on. It's obviously basically the same show, just a little bit of a new spin here on Badlands, and no better person to kind of hop on for the second episode. We talked some AFC East and everything like that with Mike Giardi last weekend. Zack Rosenblatt of The Athletic, good friend of the TOJ pod, and been on the Can't Wait pod a couple of times. Zack, how are we doing? Are you enjoying a couple of quiet days here before we start to ramp things up?
Yeah, this is the time of the year that I appreciate because I don't need to be anywhere, and so my girlfriend makes fun of me because a lot of days I'll spend, especially when it was like raining or snowing, I'll be in the apartment by myself for an entire day, and then she comes home, and then I'm talking a mile a minute because I haven't had any human contact all day. Like it's a time of the year where I have my least amount of human contact. Probably take care of myself the least amount, and then things will pick up. I'll start, going back to my phase of working out because I have time to do it and all that good stuff. But yeah, right now is a relaxing time, and then Senior Bowl next week, and then the Combine coming up, and owners meetings and free agency, and then we hit like the good stuff. But right now, this is like a nice quiet period. So.
Yeah, no, it's nice for it's nice in one sense because there's a lot of basically nothing happening if your team's not in the playoffs, but also so much happening in terms of this is where guys kind of get away, teams get away, reporters, whoever it is. But also, once we hit next week, it's kind of back locked in. And obviously Senior Bowl will be on, next week. I'll be there. I'll be able to kind of give everyone kind of a breakdown and recap from Mobile. But a lot of these Jets issues or big offseason talking points aren't just around the draft. It's around free agency, coaching changes, which we have not really seen much of, obviously, outside of Taylor Embry. Aaron White caught extended this week. What's been your kind of take on the last month or so? I guess just stuff coming out of the Jets building in terms of rhetoric or how the season finished up. Like, I guess, kind of summarize, the last month before we kind of look ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of them setting the table for the offseason. I think Robert Saleh is trying to fill out his offensive staff. I don't think they're going to really like the defensive staff is what they brought in They brought back Aaron Whitecotton, I should say, and the only other one that I think they were at risk of really losing was Marquand Manuel as like a DC, which I think I think he's an underrated coach, honestly.
I just don't understand how Tony Oden has still not gotten a single interview.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Well, Marquand at least has experience as a DC, so in that regard, I get it. But yeah, Tony Oden's obviously done what he's done with the cornerbacks, but
what he just reminds me of? I know before I cut you off, he kind of is like that actor that's so good at one role that anytime someone tries to give him a different role, it's like, I don't know, like you get typecast, and like he's so good at developing.
I always think of Michael Imperioli from The Sopranos for that. Like he can never like break away from that role. But and then on the offensive side, they let go of Taylor Embry. I think he has some other opportunities out there. So I wouldn't say mutual parting. Like he definitely was like let go, but I do think there was an aspect of he had other opportunities, and he was, I don't know where he's going to end up. I think he's interviewed for other jobs. I think that Robert Saleh has looked into like adding another voice into the offensive coaching staff. I don't know what exactly that'll look like or if it'll change the structure of what the Jets are doing, but I do know they've looked to add. I don't think they're planning on losing anybody else, like in terms of like guys getting hired elsewhere. Keith Carter and Todd Downing, especially Keith Carter, have been obviously big topics of conversation on Jets Twitter. They're coming back. I don't think that was ever in doubt, even despite all the social media hubbub. I think Robert Saleh was Keith Carter, especially like when he hired Hackett, Carter, Downing. Carter was the one he was most excited about. He considered that a home run. He raved about it. He thought this is going to change everything. Obviously, didn't exactly work out. You can debate how much of that is Keith Carter's fault, I guess. But ultimately, that Saleh believes in those coaches, even if some of his players don't, I guess.
Yeah, the Keith Carter thing's unfortunate because usually it's guys have left the building. You get the article, emptying the notebook, quote unquote. But this is current players. This is guys not even in that position room. This is guys that you really wouldn't expect to speak up, right? You see some offensive line. There's some guys that have commented or like to retweet stuff that are like the nicest guys on the team that you would never expect to even be involved in that type of stuff. So I don't think it's just a coaching thing. I think it's just with how he connects with players. I'm not sure from what I understand that, it's not necessarily that's something that he may want to work on in the next couple of months before these guys come back, in the springtime. Outside of the coaching staff, obviously there's kind of a couple of the big topics of either retaining in-house free agents. We've heard them talk about backup quarterback, wide receiver. I guess we kind of hit in each one, but we've talked about Bryce Huff a lot, and I've talked about him on every show, and it's obviously their number one pending free agent. He's one of the biggest name free agents, I think, in terms of who will have a biggest market, upcoming. Usually you don't see a 25-year-old guy to premier position hit the market, whether you view him as a 3-down player or not. Doesn't really matter because that's the NFL views him as a guy that's going to get paid a good amount of money. Gut feeling at this point, I know it's a lot of negotiations. It's a lot of public stuff. Bryce is not going to say much. Joe Douglas is certainly not going to say much. He never talks anyways.
Yeah.
What have you made this whole situation? And do you not feel like the Jets dropped the ball a little bit of I feel like they could have easily hammered out an extension at any of these points if they really, I don't know, the Will McDonald pick and this whole thing has just become a huge, not mess, that's not the right word to phrase it, but it's become a little bit of a stumbling block, I feel like, for building this roster the right way to go compete in 24.
Yeah, I don't know. I think they've always been very high on Bryce Huff. I don't know if they saw him having necessarily the season he had, because I think you look at the Will McDonald pick, in retrospect, it feels like they were planning for the possibility of losing Bryce Huff because you can slide him into that role as he develops into like Bryce Huff. He's mostly a pass rusher right now. He's not really the other stuff yet. So I guess that was their logic. And then Bryce Huff has 10 sacks, the most efficient pass rusher in the league outside of Micah Parsons or whatever. And his price keeps going up and up and up. And I do know that there were conversations about re-signing him during the season. They just ultimately decided they didn't want to sign any of these guys to new deals during these. You look at Thomas Morstead and Greg Zuerlein, I'm sure they would have liked to, lock those guys up. They didn't. So now you're going to go into the offseason, and I think Bryce Huff's salary is as high as the asking price is going to be as high as it's ever been. Like you said, he's young. He's a homegrown guy. You ideally don't want those guys to leave. I know some people have dreamed about franchise tag and trade. That's not going to happen. It's pretty hard for that to work. And you have to fit the $21 million under your salary cap. And the Jets have no cap space right now. They have $4 million, I think, on over the cap. And I don't know if that's including rollover cap and stuff like that, but they're going to have to do a lot of maneuvering anyway. So I think ultimately my feeling, and this isn't an official report or anything, but just based on the cap figures and drafting Will McDonald last year, I think what it'll come down to is, do they want to keep Bryce Huff at 15 to 18 million a year, or do they want to keep John Franklin Myers? I don't see how you could pay both of those guys. Jermaine Johnson is going to be an entrenched starter because he's the best one out of all of them, I think. And the idea of Jermaine Johnson and Bryce Huff taking care of the edges for the next 5 years is a very exciting proposition that not many teams could beat, especially because Jermaine Johnson has become such a fully fledged defensive end, not just pass rusher. But JFM would be a tough loss. And so I think there's definitely a case to be made to keeping him over Bryce Huff just because of his versatility and leadership and all that stuff. And Bryce hasn't proved himself as more than a 50% of the snaps guy. But yeah, it's a complicated thing. And I don't know. I don't think whatever they do, I don't think fans are going to be happy with either way. Either they bring Bryce Huff and they get rid of a guy like JFM. I get the sense fans would probably prefer Huff. Not that will make an impact. But yeah, the Will McDonald factor is there though. So I think you draft Will McDonald. If they let Bryce Huff go, I think it's because they believe Will McDonald is ready to take on a bigger role. If they bring Bryce Huff back, I think the opposite is true, or they still think Will McDonald needs some development, which is probably the case because the guy played, I think, 90 pass rushing snaps last year for the entire season. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things here. You're going to lose Carl Lawson. Obviously, he wasn't even a part of the team really this year. How much do you believe in Michael Clemens? But, Jermaine Johnson's locked in. JFM, if he's on the team, is locked in. And so you have to decide, do you want to pay $18 million a year to a guy, hypothetically, if you keep everybody, that would not be a starter. That's a tough pill to swallow for not I'm sure Joe Douglas would love to do it, but would the owner want to do that is also a big part of it. He's the one who's writing the checks ultimately. So
yeah. And Woody's been an interesting kind of figure in terms of he spent a ton of money in cash this year. And it's not that Woody's ever been cheap, but he also the Jets have this thing where they just do these half measures. And
yeah,
if you're going to spend $280 million in liquid cash in a season and then cheap out and say, we don't want to spend $285. We have a bar. It's a frustration I think Yankee fans have. I think a lot of teams always get mad when their teams don't spend a ton of money. I get it. It's not anyone's money but those owners, and they own a business, right? I get it, but I do think there's sometimes where you look at it and you go this is where you draw the line. Oh, now we're going to go cheap, but we just paid Aaron Rodgers a $60 million signing bonus. He played 4 snaps. But now with like, just that's unfortunate. It's part of the reality of the NFL. I want to ask you about a couple of those guys. You mentioned, obviously Morstead and Zerline. Justin Hardy's a free agent as well. I don't think Justin Hardy's like, this is probably the last time he's getting paid. So like, if he's not taking $500K a year from the Jets, I can tell you that for a fact from speaking with some people about like that's not happening. He's gonna probably have to get what he's been getting. Ashton Davis, Solomon Thomas, Quinn Jefferson. There's a bunch of names out there. Is there anybody that we're not thinking about that, like, I guess could be a surprise, gets post June 1 or just outright cut to create cap space? Or any guys like that? Like, I just feel like it's probably easier to just restructure Lazard and Tomlinson and just like kick the can down the road. It doesn't really help you that much this year. As much as I know fans want both those guys gone. I just feel like those are really the only names I could think of that are like, would be surprised they're not on the roster next year. I'm not really sure. Uzama feels like, unless he's going to play for $2 or $3 million, he's likely probably going somewhere else.
Yeah, that's the thing, that they don't really have a lot of avenues to cut guys for cap space if you don't want to like hurt your roster in the process. So that's why it's going to be very interesting to see because Joe Douglas is probably going to have to do a lot of kicking the can down the road, which I don't think they love doing. He did a lot this last year, and that's why you have like $20 million in salary committed to guys.
Isn't it crazy if they didn't do that last year, because Rodgers restructured and took a legit just pay cut, which no one, I think when Connor reported, everyone's like, I got like 4 or 5 texts in that before it came out. They're like, no fucking way. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, and then Connor was right, so give him his props. But like, they didn't have to restructure Dwayne Brown and add all these void years and Uzama and Lawson. Like, no one, like, they didn't have to do that. Like, they just simply didn't, and it hit them in the ass.
I'd say I think they needed to a degree to like, for like operating costs, like just throughout the season. The one that, I mean, the two I would say that made the least sense were Uzama and who was another one they restructured?
I guess Lawson, they added a void year, and
Lawson.
It was ridiculous.
I was going to say Lawson. Yeah, the Lawson one looks bad in retrospect because at that point, I guess they hadn't drafted Will McDonald yet, but you clearly like had your eye on
shopping. Like, that's what it doesn't understand. They were shopping Carl during the draft. Like, I know for a fact.
But so they could have cut Carl Lawson for no dead cap hit. Instead, they guaranteed him like $9 million or whatever it was, and then you proceeded to not play him at all. Like, I know hindsight's 2020. They couldn't have seen him falling off the way he did. Probably, he hurt his back in camp, like all that stuff. But that was the one that I think is going to reflect the most poorly. But ultimately, that Dwayne Brown, I don't even think they restructured Dwayne Brown. I think that was just the structure of his contract when they signed him.
Yeah, when they signed him, they fitted all the money in from 2 years ago.
They restructured Jordan White. I mean, this is what happened when you're paying a quarterback, even with Aaron Rodgers' pay cut, they're still paying him a lot of money. And when you do that in order to like survive, this is what the Saints did for years with Drew Brees. They just had to keep pushing it down the road, and then it comes back to bite you later on. It's kind of doing it already for them because they don't have a lot of money. There's ways around it. There's what the salary cap. I don't believe in the salary cap isn't a real thing. It is real because if it wasn't, then teams wouldn't have to like cut good players to save money, which, the Jets, I think JFM would be the surprise one, just to circle back to answer your question. Not like a huge surprise, because I think people are like prepared for that possibility, but like, look, they're going to have to sign offensive linemen, at least one, probably two, and probably more if you include depth. They're going to need to sign a backup quarterback, a veteran. I'd argue they should get a veteran running back backup, not for a lot, like hopefully you get him for the minimum, but a number 2 receiver. If they're going for a veteran guy, like you're either going to have to trade a bunch for a guy who's making a lot of money, or you're going to have to sign a guy for a bunch. I don't think they should. I know there's a tendency, especially, because free agency is the Jets Super Bowl, like you want to go and get the big name on the market. Pretty rare that if you pay the most to a guy in free agency positionally, it works out, especially offensive line receiver. I say that as someone who covered the Giants, and they paid Nate Solder and Kenny Golladay within like a 3-year stretch, and both of those were disastrous. Like usually if a guy's available, there's a reason. I know there's some unique circumstances, but that's not the route I would go. I wouldn't go for the top guy in the market, especially because the top guy in the market offensive tackle-wise this year is Tyron Smith. And while he's very good and obviously would be an upgrade, he also has rarely played a full season, and he's getting older. I think Trent Brown's the next one. He's played 1 full season in the last, 5 years.
Yeah, going from Mekhi Becton to Trent Brown is a good choice.
So it's like the one I'm intrigued by, and I wrote about this the other day, so that's why it's on the top of my mind. Michael Onwenu is intriguing. I'm curious to see what kind of money he gets because he's young and versatile, more of a right tackle. Then you draft the left tackle in theory. But I think that's the path I would go. You go for a guy that maybe isn't going to make $20 million a year, but if you can get a contract that's like 12 to 15 million a year, or whatever it is. That's ideal. You decide what I don't think they should cut Lakin ultimately if you can get it, but he needs a pay cut or a restructure. If he's not going to do that, you cut him. But that you're just creating more holes. And the reality is, the guy you're going to sign to replace Lakin Tomlinson is probably around the same quality of player. So I know fans, like you said, like they want to get rid of him. I don't think he's as bad as fans think. He's not as good as his contract. Like, there's somewhere in the middle there. He's probably an average player, and when he's bad, he's below average. But you don't want to create too many holes. Some stability. Like, he's a guy that he'd be next to Joe Tippmann again. It's good for Joe Tippmann to be next to him and AVT guys he's familiar with, and you fill out the tackle spots. But anyway, the point being, to just like all the cap stuff, like they are going to have to get creative, and you're either going to see guys that are surprises get cut, like a JFM, or you're going to see a lot of restructures to where, Joe Douglas is all in on the season. If they don't make the playoffs, he's probably gone. The next GM is going to have to clean up the mess. So it's going to be a very interesting offseason to see how Joe maneuvers under the cap, because, like you said, there's not a lot of moves. Like, Alan Lazard is a guy that everybody in the building probably would be fine cutting if they could, but the contract doesn't really allow them to do that. So he's a tough, like you mentioned him as a restructure. It's kind of crazy to think about. You'd restructure a guy like that you're going to cut next year, but they might not have a choice. So
yeah, it's just there's a couple of those that are tough, and then there's